Welcome back. Either of these are days of great joy and anticipation or dread. President Trump has delivered as promised, nominating a Supreme Court justice who will likely be the decisive vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, the Supreme Court decision which made abortion rights legal. If you're pro-life, this is why it was worth being on the Trump train, even though many of you express reservations about his personal behavior and temperament. If you're pro-choice, this is exactly what you warned those who just couldn't get themselves to warm up to Hillary. Happy now? Joining us for more are Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. Susan, did I get that about right?
I think you did, definitely. A lot of us on the left were actually still gasping over the idea that Kennedy was stepping down, and then, yeah, knowing exactly what that would mean and all of the social issues that we've gained throughout the decades are at risk right now, so absolutely.
But clearly those who were, I don't want to say Bernie or a bust, or people who voted third party, were not persuaded by that argument during the presidential election, and as we often say, elections have consequences.
They do have a lot of consequences, and that's why this November is an extremely important election. You're right, it wasn't, because I don't think they believed that Trump had a chance, so it wasn't a concern for them. I thought they always thought their fight was against Hillary, and so therefore that was their focus. But how many people actually go to the polls and are concerned about judicial nominations?
Well, that's the question I was going to put to Rod, because obviously, Rod, conservatives do.
Yeah, in fact, I thought you really nailed it there, because I was in that group that wasn't particularly fond of Trump. I mentioned it before. He was my last choice in the primary. He became immediately my choice in the general, and that was large part because of court nominations, not just Supreme Court, but all the federal judiciary, because it's all really important. Kind of unfortunate, but true, it's really important. The other part I would say, though, with that is that Hillary was just a gosh-awful candidate, and that was part of the problem, too. It wasn't just that people didn't take the judicial nomination seriously. People couldn't warm up to Hillary as a candidate. But,
right, but there have been probably a lot of Republicans that you have voted for despite not liking them, because you see the bigger picture.
Well, this is an example of that. I mean, Trump wasn't my guy. I will say, as I've mentioned on your program before, however, in the year and a half he's been president, I've been shocked at how conservative he's actually governed, so I've been all the more pleased. But my vote was largely based on not Hillary, judicial nominations. That was my support for him.
And we're looking back here instead of looking forward, Susan, but I do want to get to this point. Do you feel that Democratic voters or progressive voters are waking up towards this reality that either they blew it in the last election and they should have seen the bigger picture here, or resolve to go to the polls in November?
I hope they're going to resolve to go to the polls in November, because and I actually think that this pick will go through, no matter how much is...
That's next segment.
Okay. I won't go into that right now, but the bottom line is there's other things that can be done in order to protect their interest, and it has to start at the polls.
And you know, obviously this is going to be an interesting couple of months here, and we'll preview what we're going to do in the next segment, because I'm sure the Democrats are thinking right now about how to gum up the process, if that is at all possible.
Yes.
All right. Our conversation on President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court continues. Welcome back. We are talking about President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court, and joining us for more are Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. Today, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell took to the Senate floor to criticize the Democrats for already starting the campaign to try to target the new Supreme Court nomination. This is what Senator McConnell had to say.
Some of our Democratic colleagues seem to me, Madam President, to be a little confused. They seem to be confusing the nature of a political office with the nature of a judicial office.
That's really rich, Rod.
Why?
Yeah, Rod, why?
Because that's coming from a man who used the political process, even though President Obama had a year left in his term, to not let him seat or nominate or actually have a hearing for his Supreme Court nomination, because there was a strategy which worked, and the ends justified the means. So that once that becomes the rules of the road, would you begrudge the Democrats for finding any excuse in the world, if they even can, to derail this nomination?
Well, a couple thoughts there. Number one, that was certainly hardball at the time. I was a little bit surprised because I didn't think McConnell had it in, but that was hardball. However, it wasn't precedent-setting hardball.
There was no law. There was no law. There was no rule.
Nope.
It was a decision.
It was a decision, and it was a decision that had been made before, when there was less than a year in a president's final term. So I mean, I'm not surprised by that. I'm surprised that McConnell is surprised at his colleagues' response.
So here's the question: would you begrudge the Democrats if they had a method or an avenue to derail this in any way that they could possibly?
Here's what I begrudge them, really, is people like Senator Nelson coming out several days ago and said, "I'm voting against whoever the nominee is." Period. I don't see how that is advice and consent. If you're interested in anything at all doing with the Constitution in your job, or if it is just all a power play. Look, Harry Reid made it a power play a few years ago when he changed the rules.
It's no longer about.
And he's regretting it, I'm sure.
But it's no longer about the final result. The result is the only thing. It's not about the means that you get there.
Well, I wish that wasn't the case. It looks more and more like that's the case. And there's a long history of that goes back to Teddy Kennedy and Robert Bork.
Susan, as we said, that the Democrats are trying to think of how they can try to derail this nomination here, but there are already stories out there that the key Republican senators that you would need, Susan Collins of Maine and Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, are signaling comfort with Kavanaugh. So is that game over?
Well, pretty much. I mean, right now, I think all they're going to do is besiege the Public Records Office and go through 120,000 pages in hopes to find something. More than anything, just to slow it down as much as they can to get to November, because the idea is that they can get a 51 majority, which, as of the polls today, they're pretty close, that there's a chance that they can then do something about it. But I would say that it's an effort in futility at this point.
Okay, we are just getting warmed up. Our conversation on President Trump's nomination of Brett Kavanaugh as the next Supreme Court Justice will continue after a quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are talking about President Trump's pick for the Supreme Court, and joining us for more are Rod Thompson of the RevolutionaryAct.com and Susan Nylon of the Nylon Report. And Rod, there was one more thing that you wanted to add about the political process.
Right. I think it is a very steep hill to climb, as Susan was saying, for the Democrats to actually stop it. They'd have to flip one or two Republican senators, both of which who have kind of signaled they're not going to, and who voted for Gorsuch last year, and who voted for Kavanaugh on the federal appeals court before. So pretty hard to get them to flip on him, probably. Plus, they have to hold 5 senators in states that Trump won by 10 points in line, particularly like a Joe Manchin. So very, very difficult for them to flip it. And if they actually did, that, I think, would really energize the Republican Trump turnout in November. So it actually could hurt them in those Senate races if they were successful with Kavanaugh. Interesting dynamic.
Right, we've been talking about the process. Let's talk about the bigger picture and the bigger issues. And number one is abortion. Susan, are Democrats getting their minds wrapped around the fact that Roe versus Wade will likely be overturned, and states, including Florida, might then subsequently pass very restrictive abortion legislation, if not outlaw it altogether?
Well, I think there definitely is a concern, and the irony is I don't think the concern is necessarily just abortion. I think we need to recognize that Roe versus Wade is about privacy, and if that gets that gets overturned, the privacy issue will then go beyond it, and I think that's actually an even bigger picture that nobody's really paying attention to. I can say, though, that this pick did say when he was on the courts at a lower level that if there was binding precedent for, he will recognize the fact that Roe versus Wade is there. The problem I don't think people recognize is that the Supreme Court doesn't have to follow binding precedent. He can decide whatever he wants to do, and it doesn't matter what's on the books up until that point.
Well, right, exactly right. And it's been great that they don't have to, because they were able to overturn Dred Scott, and they were able to overturn Plessy Ferguson, right? Separate but equal. Both of those terrible Supreme Court decisions that were precedents that were overturned, rightly so. I honestly think Roe v. Wade, I'm just going to be flat out honest, I think it's a scare tactic to gin up the base and the fundraise. I honestly don't think that Roe v. Wade, unfortunately in my opinion, is in any danger whatsoever. Because here's why. Because I don't think Kavanaugh or Roberts are going to vote to overturn it. I think Roberts, and I've heard a number of people who have done some really serious looking into his background, I think that he's very much in the mode of Roberts. Roberts is one that likes to rule very narrowly on law, not expansive rulings at all. He's not Scalia, he's not Thomas, he's not Alito. I don't think that you would get either of them to even take a case. Where I do think you will see abortion impacted, perhaps, if Kavanaugh is approved, is on the Pennsylvania versus Casey law, where, you know, that had that undue burden sort of thing, and that undue burden is something that it was very expansive, and I think that you could see cases that they would say yes to that could sort of restrict and pull that in.
You kind of ruined my next question.
Oh, sorry.
So let me ask you. Kaiser Family Fund Health Tracking Poll found that in the days after Kennedy's announcement that he was retiring, 2/3 of Americans said that they do not want to see Roe versus Wade overturned.
Right. Well, and that doesn't really surprise me because it's been the law for a long time, and it would cause tremendous upheaval. What bothers me is when I see a lot of talking heads saying that this nomination will criminalize abortion. No, it doesn't. All it does is throw it back to the states, where probably a good half of the states will have fairly liberal laws on abortion.
So, but here's the thing. Several things are going to happen. You can chip away at it where it doesn't have the same impact that it did before. And that'll make a big difference in the issue of the states. And, you know, there's a chance they could leave it up to the states as well. And then you'll have a patchwork quilt that'll just be a total mess.
We showed Mitch McConnell a little bit earlier. Let's show Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer today talking about this very issue.
In selecting Judge Kavanaugh, President Trump did exactly what he said he would do on the campaign trail: nominate someone who will overturn women's reproductive rights and strike down health care protections for millions of Americans.
That was basically what Susan was talking about. You don't buy it, Rod.
I don't buy it at all. I do think that scare tactics. Look, ever since Bork, really, we've had every Republican nomination has been about, oh no, Roe v. Wade is endangered. Oh no, Roe v. Wade is endangered. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand last night was saying that women's freedom was what she kept saying is endangered. This is wildly overstated. Their First Amendment rights aren't endangered anyway. Lesbians can marry. I don't think women's freedoms are in danger. It's one issue, it's abortion, and like Susan said, we both agree, it's probably more like chipping away at abortion, but you cannot fundraise and whip up your base saying they might chip away at abortion rights. It's got to be Roe v. Wade.
Well, they will. It's not that
they probably will.
Let's talk about whether one other issue is overstated or not, and that is Judge Kavanaugh's writings about whether or not a president can be investigated and indicted, which obviously is in the news since this president is under criminal investigation, and parts of that case, whether he could be subpoenaed to testify before the special counsel, could go to the Supreme Court. Susan, you've been reading what they've been saying and what Judge Kavanaugh said in terms of his concerns about what would happen if a president is indicted or even investigated. What's your reaction?
Well, my reaction is awfully hypocritical, since he cut his teeth with Kenneth Starr and the pursuit of President Clinton during his impeachment process. So, you know, and yeah, I get what he's trying to say is that it would be a complete disruption, but no one is above the law, and if you are a criminal, you need to be held accountable no matter who you are.
He is saying that, he says, because he then went to work for George W. Bush and saw inside the White House what could potentially happen if a president is distracted by some kind of investigation. But Rod, that kind of sets up something that would...
That's why he's Trump popular.
Can a president act so, and I'm not talking about any particular president, but so criminally wrong that you
No, absolutely not. We have a process in place. It's called impeachment. It's given to the Congress in the Constitution. They can impeach a president for high crimes and misdemeanors. It's right there. That's how we do it. The reason that I actually read a whole bunch of that Minnesota Law Review, gosh, that was thick, thing that he wrote, 33 pages that he wrote. He was talking about, he was making the case that Congress should pass a law doing this. He never said the courts should or even could rule on that, which is a very interesting asterisk.
What is interesting about what he wrote there is he didn't say it is constitutionally improper to investigate or indict but rather that you shouldn't do it, which really raises the question about whether his position is that the president can be indicted.
You know, it's kind of funny that a constitutional attorney would actually address that issue. I don't know where he's coming from or why he thinks that he's at solid ground to stand on. And I can't imagine you can convince the American people that that would hold any water.
Well, just one follow-up on that, though, is that he also says in that article, though, that it's only temporarily that it's put off. Once the president's out of office, then he's opened up. It's just a shield for while he's in office.
My other question here is, as Rod inferred, isn't this academic, Susan? Because I don't know a lot of people who really believe that Mueller would go for an indictment of the president, but he would be making a case. He might, you know, theoretically name Trump as a unindicted co-conspirator like Archibald Cox did with Nixon, but that he's going to write a report, and either he is going to have recommendations of criminal violations for you know, impeachment purposes, but he's not going to actually indict the president.
Yeah, I don't think, I mean, he can suggest it, but that's about to the extent of it, and you're absolutely right. But I think my concern is that this is sending a message to anyone else who is either in Trump's position or thinking that of going into it. When you tell someone like the president, like Nixon, when the president does it, it's, you know, it's not breaking the law. What does that?
That's not what that's saying, though. It's saying that he's shielded while he's in the office, but he's not afterwards.
Yeah, but then there's a lot that can happen between the time that they're in the office and the time that they're out, and there's a lot of political things that can be done to help prevent that. I'm sorry, if you're breaking the law, you should be dealt with right away.
We have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in just a moment. Stay with us. And our guests join us right now for final thoughts. And Rod, you see what the landscape is here. You know, are you confident that Judge Kavanaugh is going to have a seat on the Supreme Court?
95% confident, yes, I am.
Where's the 5%?
The 5% is that if they can flip Lisa Murkowski or Susan Collins and then hold all of their Democrats that are in those heavily red states, then yeah, then they can. Basically, because I think it's possible McCain might not be able to make the vote, and if he can't, then that basically they only need to flip one if that's the case. So that's not impossible, but I still think it's a big haul and unlikely, and I think they pay the price for that at the polls in November if they actually do that, because I think they'll lose seats because of that, because on my side of the aisle, it would be really, really juiced up over such a thing.
Susan, anybody who really looks at this is saying that the odds of the Democrats derailing this nomination are small.
Yeah.
So what do Democrats do next?
Well, I think Democrats, I said it earlier, I'm going to say it again, they need to focus on the polls. They need to regain the House and the Senate, and they need to put people in place who will take a look. You can, if you don't ever want to have a discussion about Roe versus Wade again, you can amend the Constitution for it.
Yeah, but when was the last time we amended the Constitution?
Well, you know, in
We're
my
still waiting
lifetime,
for the ERA.
I get it, I do, but I'm saying if you had that focus and you put the right people in place, it can be done. It has been done. We've amended the Constitution many times. That is where we need to be focused on, not getting caught up in this
Rod, the one thing
nomination.
that I'm kind of surprised by talking to you tonight is that for I can't remember how many years, this has been the dream come true for Republicans or people who are pro-life, that finally shifting the balance on the Supreme Court. But you're saying tonight that you don't think, even though the balance will shift, excuse me, Roe versus Wade will be overturned.
I really don't. I mean, I see the balance shifting. I think what we have in place is 5 constitutionalist / originalist textualist judges in place. So those judges who I don't necessarily break the court down as is often done by politically liberal and conservative. I break it down as sort of constitutionalist / unfairly maybe social activist.
But what he's not acknowledging also is the younger generation of Republicans also are in support of Roe versus Wade, and there's a changing tide within his party itself, and I think that makes a big difference as well.